Welcome to this next panel. It is Protecting Farmed Animals and Preserving Land Sources. I'm your moderator, Jamie McLaughlin. I serve as Vice President for the UIA Animal Law Working Group and also with the ABA International Animal Law Committee as their Programming Vice Chair. Before we get started, I'd like to give a special thank you to Beyond Meat for sponsoring this panel today. We're going to be exploring farmed animal advocacy and land resource protection, addressing recent efforts to challenge farmed animal exemptions from legal protections, utilizing private prosecution for farmed animals, and potential federal mismanagement of public lands. So before we start the presentations, I'm going to be introducing my panelists here. My first speaker is Cynthia von Schlichten. She has been practicing law for over 14 years. She's a lifelong animal rights advocate. She currently serves as general counsel for Farm Sanctuary, a US-based animal rights nonprofit, and has been with the organization for 4 years. Cynthia has an LLM in animal law from Lewis and Clark and is currently an adjunct professor for CALS. She's also a member of the American Bar Association Animal Law Committee, its Animals and Agriculture Subcommittee, and is co-chair of its International Animal Law Subcommittee. She's a regular speaker on animal rights issues, presenting most recently in person at the International Animal Rights Conference that was held in Luxembourg. And for over 20 years, she's been a dedicated participant in this movement and remains impassioned about taking on the challenges ahead to make the world a better place for animals. Our other speaker today is Cheryl Leahy. She led the legal advocacy program at Animal Outlook from 2006 to 2019 and is general counsel targeting large-scale farmed animal abuse through undercover investigations, proactive litigation, policy, and innovative legal campaigns. From 2019 to 2020, she served as Animal Outlook's executive VP, and in 2020 became executive director. Cheryl guides the strategic direction of the organization, especially focusing on the use of undercover as a mechanism for high-impact advocacy and culture change, and on targeting systematic animal abuse of farmed animals through proactive litigation. Her work includes challenging cruel yet standard practices forced upon farmed animals, as well as misleading marketing and unfair business practices by corporations that produce meat, milk, and eggs. Cheryl got her JD from UCLA and her BA from the University of Chicago in environmental studies. So let's welcome our first speaker, Cynthia von Schlichten.
Hi, everyone. Before I get started, I just want to thank ALDF and Lewis and Clark for inviting me to speak in this fabulous conference. This is my favorite conference every year, going all the way back to when I was in law school. I just think it's really energizing and inspiring, and so I'm just super honored to now be actually a speaker. So I'm going to be talking to you today about grazing on public land. But before I get into it, I feel like it would make sense to define public land and define grazing so we're kind of all on the same page. So public land are areas of land and water that are actually collectively owned by the US citizens and managed usually by the government. For purposes of today, I'm going to be talking about the federal government. And then grazing is the practice of allowing farmed animals to roam across land feeding on wild vegetation, most often grass. So it's pretty much what you would think. And then I also want to share this quote from the Western Watersheds Project, as I think it really sets the tone for this talk. These lands are supposed to be held in trust for all Americans, yet a small subset of private interests have been granted the privilege to use them for grazing, often at a fraction of the cost that private landowners would charge. How much of a fraction of a cost? Well, you have to stay tuned. So approximately 155 million acres of public land is leased for livestock grazing. To put it another way, livestock grazing takes place on approximately 25% of the public land across the United States. And the Bureau of Land Management administers nearly 18,000 permits and leases to ranchers who get to use the land for a nominal charge. How nominal? You have to stay tuned to find out. And this is a little off topic, but when I was thinking about land use in Big Ag, I was thinking, well, another part of the story is all the land they use to grow the grain to feed all of these animals. So it's a little off topic, but I am going to address that towards the end. So how did we get here? And I have this history lesson here because I just think it's so ironic. So in the early 1800s, free forage on unclaimed public land was allowed, and it really grew the sheep and cattle sort of empires. But not surprisingly, the ranges became overcrowded, overstocked, and overgrazed. And people were concerned about this. And I think it's funny because this is way before factory farming came along. And I feel like the people from the early 1800s who were concerned about this, their heads would just explode if they saw the level of exploitation that's happening today on the land. But nevertheless, this was a concern. So in the early 1900s, Congress designated the U.S. Forest Service, which is part of the USDA, as sort of the premier grazing control agency. And from 1906 to 1907, the Forest Service implemented a system of regulation to sort of manage this use of the land, including allotments and permits and herd size and fees and all that sort of stuff, to try to manage this concern that everyone had about the overgrazing, overstocked, overcrowded. And then in 1976, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act came about, and this was supposed to establish public land policy and guidelines for administration. But I think it's ironic because we have all these government systems that were put in place initially because everyone was worried about the overstocked, overgrazing, overcrowded. And I think all of these systems have only enabled the problem and actually made it worse. So who is in charge? Well, I say on paper, not on paper, Big Ag is in charge, let's be honest. On paper, it's the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, and they have slightly different roles, but they're basically the same. And these are their missions. I always like to include missions of government agencies. And if you see here, the mission is nothing about actually trying to protect the environment. It's certainly not about wildlife. Wildlife's not on the radar. It's about protecting the land so we can keep using it. That's all. For present and future generations. How can we protect this land just enough so that we can continue to exploit it today and tomorrow? So how does it happen? How does public land sort of become a factory farm machine? Well, you need an application, and you have to be a US citizen or have a validly licensed business to apply for a BLM grazing permit or lease. And you have to have a property of land that you either own or control that can serve as the base property, which is really like the nexus for a livestock operation. And then you also, of course, have to have livestock, and that can be owned or controlled as well under the BLM. And then you need a NEPA analysis, in theory, as part of your application process. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, and the analysis is required to analyze the environmental effects that the livestock grazing would have, and it pertains to both the initial application and the renewals, which we'll talk about in a minute. More specifically, it's to consider the effects of every major federal action significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. Again, this bugs me because it's talking about the humans once again. We're not worried about the environment for environment's sake, and obviously we're not worried about wildlife at this point. But as flawed as NEPA analysis is, it's not really happening anyway. So 63% of current BLM grazing permits are issued without a NEPA analysis. And weirdly and unfortunately, that number actually goes up when the allotment involves an Endangered Species Act critical habitat. Then it's about 76 permits are authorized without NEPA analysis. Okay, so this pop quiz, I've alluded to this mystical question a couple of times. How much does it cost Big Ag to obtain one of these permits? And I'm gonna ask you to raise your hand when we get to the number that you think it is. Okay, $200 per cow, 50, 20, thank you for participating, $2, or the land is gifted to Big Ag complete with red bow. Okay, well, thank you for participating. It's not really any of these, so it's a trick question. But it's somewhere between D and E. And now we're gonna hopefully watch a video. Yay, the video worked. Okay, so there's your answer. And that video was done, I believe it was released in 2019. But I can confirm to you that the number is still a whopping $1.35 per animal unit. And by contrast, the market rate for private grazing is about $22.60. Of course, that's in 2019, so that has probably gone up. And this grazing fee calculation came about in 1978 and then remained under use under a 1986 presidential executive order. And I mention that because 1978 and 1986 were a long time ago. And everything else on planet Earth has gone up because of inflation. But this apparently has not. It's still $1.35. And under that order, the grazing fee can't fall below $1.35. So there's that. But any increase or decrease cannot exceed more than 25%. And I looked back on the last few years, it did go up to a whopping, wait for it, $1.41, but don't panic, it went back down to $1.35 the next year. Okay, and then there's the renewal process. So you have your permit, it's good for 10 years. And then you apply for renewal. This is also flawed. One of the biggest problems with renewal, in my opinion, is your initial permit can completely expire and you can continue grazing on that land as long as you've started the process for the renewal. So you don't actually have to go through that process to continue grazing. And part of that process includes a NEPA analysis. So you're supposed to do another NEPA analysis. And if there's an allotment that involves an endangered species, threatened or endangered habitat, you're supposed to have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife also be involved in that process. But like the applications, the NEPA analysis is not happening. So in 2013, 28% were authorized without NEPA analysis. It went up to 38% in 2017, and then to 54% in 2021. And I'm guessing it's probably even higher now. Existing monitoring and data and assessments are supposed to be reviewed to determine that land health standards are being met. But according to a report by the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, of the lands that were evaluated, more than 50% did not meet standards. Okay, so let's get into some specifics about the environmental and wildlife implications of all of this. And I would say that's cyclical. So if there are environmental issues, they're going to cause wildlife problems and vice versa. So with regard to environmental, this most heavily impacts the western part of our country, such as the high cold deserts of Nevada, Wyoming, and southern Idaho. It's the most significant cause of non-point water pollution and desertification. There's also destruction of native vegetation due to overgrazing and overtrampling. So note to our ranchers from the early 1800s, we've made no progress with this. And this reduces plant diversity, affects the ecosystem, native plants are replaced with invasive species. It's a mess. And then soil erosion, constant trampling and the compacting from the livestock compromises the quality of the soil. It affects the water, which we'll talk about in a second. And it also makes the land more susceptible to the impacts of climate change. Water pollution, particularly near riparian zones, is really concerning. Again, it affects the quality of the water. It also makes the area more susceptible to drought. And then sort of far-reaching consequences, overgrazed lands are less able to act as carbon sinks. And of course, methane emissions from all that livestock is contributing to global warming. And just for an example, in Nevada alone, approximately 22 million acres of public grazing land does not meet health standards. And then for wildlife, it doesn't get any better. So again, this is largely in the West, and it is one of the primary causes of native species endangerment in the West. We talked about how the environmental implications affects the wildlife and their habitat. But in addition to that, species that are seen as sort of a threat to livestock are killed in mass, often by the government, such as wild wolves and coyotes. This disrupts the predator-prey balance, creating more problems with the ecosystem. And it's also just disturbing. It clearly is saying that the government is prioritizing its investment over wildlife. And for example, in 2021, approximately 1.75 million wild animals were killed to protect the agricultural output. I listed some great cases here. I don't have time to go through them, but know that there is good litigation happening around these issues. But I do want to draw your attention to the State Line Range Grazing Project and some litigation going on there. So the State Line Range Grazing Project is a project area of about 272,000 acres in the greater Gila bioregion. And it is It includes 46,000 animal unit months being permitted for grazing, and it involves a lot of wildlife. But today I want to talk about the endangered Mexican wolf. So, little backstory on the endangered Mexican wolf. Um, they were a problem with the agricultural output in the 70s. They were a threat to livestock, and they were known as the livestock killer. And so the government kind of went on this max execution tear of them. I would say it worked a little too well because now they're listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And this project, well, okay, let me say it this way. So they're under the Endangered Species Act, and under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, the government's pretty much not supposed to authorize or support anything that can impact or affect threatened or endangered species or their critical habitats. And I would say that this project really does both. One, because the project is taking place smack dab where the recovery area is for the wolves. And two, it's a grazing project, right? So there's going to be more livestock, and I feel like we're just going to be in the 1970s again in no time. And the issue with the litigation that I have referenced down below is they're really taking issue with the NEPA analysis that was originally brought to approve this plan because it did not look at the full picture, and it did not consider the fact that the wolves are going to continue to populate, because that's the point. That's why they're on the Endangered Species Act over the next 10 years, and how that's really going to have repercussions for this project, and it's going to affect their welfare. And we're, like I said, we're going to be in the 1970s again. So that litigation sort of centers around sort of fighting that and demanding a new NEPA analysis. But wait, there's more. So I wanted to mention about the grain, again, a little off topic, but I feel like it's so connected. Approximately 127 million acres of land is used to grow crop to feed farmed animals. And I'm going to pick on Tyson Foods for a minute, which, by the way, I mean, I have zero sympathy for Tyson Foods, but it's just funny because not only there's a lawsuit down below that I referenced here, but also I just read this week that McDonald's was suing them for price fixing. So they're taking it from every angle, which is great. So just to illustrate, because Tyson is just one company, their demand for animal feed requires between 9 and 10 million acres of corn and soybean, which is nearly twice the size of New Jersey and more than 5% of the whole crops for corn and soybean. And these numbers are from 2020. And it's just so funny because they have this ridiculous net zero by 2050, and they're like pretending they're sustainable, which I don't know how they even do that with a straight face, honestly. And this sort of obviously contributes to that. So okay, so in total, approximately 41% of land in the continental United States is used for meat, meat, dairy, and egg production. I need more coffee, apparently. And the use of public land is a big part of this. So what can we do about it? I like to always end on a positive note, and it wasn't easy with this, honestly, to find a positive note, but I'm just going to share sort of my thoughts and some things I think that are happening that are really cool. So we need to push for a change in regulation. We hear that a lot. It's true about everything. But the Federal Land Policy and Management Act is, in my opinion, not worth the paper it's written on. The NEPA analysis process, first of all, needs to actually be happening, both at the application and renewal level. And if there are issues with land or wildlife that are unearthed, pardon the pun, they need to be addressed before the grazing can happen. Because right now, my understanding is pretty much, if they do the analysis at all, if there's a problem, they just kind of carry on anyway. And some of that goes back to also my issues with the Endangered Species Act, which is a whole other presentation. But I feel like Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act like flies right in the face of the State Line Range Grazing Project, and I don't understand how the two can coexist. And I think we need to do better with actually doing what the Endangered Species Act is supposed to be doing. So as lawyers, we can certainly apply pressure with litigation. And I did read, like I said, I've read some really great cases of people really fighting the good fight. I love outside the box legal theories. So if you have those, as long as they're viable, go for it. But outside the box can also be great just for regular campaigns too that don't involve litigation. And one thing I came across in my research is the Wild Earth Guardians. And they actually have a plan where they're going to the greater Gillett bioregion and they're asking ranchers to retire their grazing permits. And they are paying them for a fee, and I don't know the fee. So you could take issue with that or not, but I like the creative workaround and the way that it's sort of stopping the grazing in its tracks, at least for that moment. And as a result, they've had grazing allotment retirement of 36,000 acres so far. So that's noteworthy. So that's everything. Thank you.
All right. So again, Jamie McLaughlin here. I'm going to be talking about, I don't want to diss any federal agencies. I know it says mismanagement, but I have some opinions about that. Could you blow the slides up a little bit bigger? I don't have notes. Okay, cool. Thanks. So there's two issues that I want to look at here. One is feral cows on our public lands, and the other is mismanagement of predator species, specifically in Wyoming. So a lot of our land is multi-use public land. The BLM and the Forest Service manage it, just like Cynthia had spoken about. The BLM has to abide by FLPMA, that's the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. And the National Forest Management Act, NIFMA, applies to the USFS, and as does their planning rules. So sometimes the uses on multiple use lands conflict. So those of you who don't have a background in archaeology, that CRM is cultural resource management. So that's things like Pueblo, cliff dwellings, and like all of that stuff that we have that we want to preserve on public lands. We've got hikers, photographers out there. We've got cows grazing out there and other animals as well. And then we have wildlife. We also have timber management because the timber is taken and sold. And we also have mineral rights. And as Cynthia was speaking about, we have a lot of grazing permits on public lands. On this slide, I just want you to notice that there's about 1.2 million cows that are on our national forests grazing right now. And some of those cattle shouldn't be there. I mean, I don't think any of them should be there, but some of them really shouldn't be there. So in the 1970s, a rancher went bankrupt. And when he did, he let loose these cattle that he had and left them in Gila National Forest. And cattle went wild. It was cows gone wild, and they populated. And so they've been dealing with this problem for 50 years, and they can't solve the issue. So they have done all kinds of things to try to get rid of the cows, but what was most concerning for people was in 2023, they're doing aerial gunning. So basically they're flying helicopters in there, USD APHIS, and they are shooting cows from helicopters, which sounds like a great use of our taxpayer dollars. So they're really worried that these cows are destroying the habitat, riparian areas and stuff like that. And also these cows are, not domestic anymore. They don't want to be around people. And there are some reports of cows menacing hikers and stuff like that. Good for the cows. Okay, so there was a protest and a lawsuit about this aerial gunning in 2023. And the crazy thing is, it was the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association that was saying, don't shoot the cows. What they wanted is for those cows to be treated as unauthorized livestock and for those cows to go be auctioned off, captured and auctioned off. But it really hinged on what those cows were classified as. Are they, unauthorized livestock? Are they feral? What is livestock? So livestock means animals of any kind that are kept and raised for use or pleasure, according to the Forest Service. And so the court, agreed with the Forest Service that these cows can't be unauthorized because they're not even livestock. So they lost and the gunning went forward. And I want to contrast these cows to some other feral cows. I don't know if you've heard of this, but off of Alaska, like it's south of Kodiak Island, I believe, there's an archipelago and there's a string of islands there that make up the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. Now, wildlife refuges are a little bit different. They're to preserve animals and for uses that are very compatible with that, unlike multi-use public lands, which have to have all those things taken care of that I noted on the other slide. So what happened is there's this island that it's referred to as the Isle of Cows. So there's all these cows that are hanging out on this island, and they're doing the exact same things that the ones in the Gila National Forest are doing. They're messing up riparian areas. They are destroying, habitat for other animals, and there'd be loss of biodiversity and all of that. And on this island, there's endangered mammals there. There are like lots of different kinds of seabirds, some that are only found there. And these animals got there by accident. So before Alaska was owned by the United States, some Russian immigrants had settled there and they brought these cows with them. So these are a different genetic makeup than the commercial cattle used for beef here in the United States. So I put down they're brown Swiss, British Hereford, and Russian Yakutian. Anyway, so these cows are allowed to remain, and there's no aerial gunning or effort at all to take these cows off of this island that is on a wildlife refuge. Why? So just to compare these things. So as I was talking about, multi-use public lands have to be managed for everybody. And the Maritime National Wildlife Refuge is for preservation and compatible recreational use. So my theory is the reason that they are not removing these animals from the wildlife refuge is because they serve a purpose for Big Ag, and that is to protect the future of meat. So if we have some disease like, I don't know, avian influenza, or like if that would ever happen to wipe out our cows, and all of our cows died, well, how would they repopulate the cows if they all were the same genetic makeup as the cows we use for commercial use now? So they are preserving these cows specifically because they might have some future use for the ag industry. So what can we do about these cows on Gila National Forest? One of the things that we could do that would be more ethical, even though it's rugged terrain, they say they can't get in there, and there's been a high mortality rate when they try to do non-lethal removal. But we could do something like use drones to dart them with PCP or any other drug that we want to use to make them not reproduce anymore. We're down to 150 cows. Obviously, it was like over 700 cows, and they've spent 300 grand on it. And I don't know how much that aerial gunner cost, but probably a lot with a helicopter and everything. So this is a fixed wing drone that can be used. It's only $80 and it's reusable. It's used to dart wildlife, and it could be easily repurposed, and we could dart those 150 cows. And if they live 20 years, the problem is hopefully done if they're not reproducing, and we don't have to chase them down with helicopters in really horrific fashion. Another thing that we could do is we could require RFID tags for cows. So this is a new rule that is taking effect next month. It's not going to apply to all cattle in the United States, just certain cattle that cross state lines. There's been a lot of resistance to implementing this. Ranchers complain of the costs, but considering all the subsidization they get, I think that they can afford a few tags. So keep tags in mind because they could have a lot of other interesting uses too. So this is another issue that you may already know about, and don't worry, there's like no trigger warnings here. I'm not going to show anything gross, but our wolves in the United States are not protected. All of the gray wolves are not protected equally in every state. They're like listed as endangered in about 44 states. They are threatened in Minnesota. And then here in the West, we have distinct populations that have specifically been delisted. And so they're not covered under the Endangered Species Act anymore. That means that they go under state management. And on our public lands, we're handing out these grazing permits, and then we're reintroducing wolves, and we're like, it's going to be fine. Nothing's going to happen. So the recovered population in Wyoming is this Northern Rockies population, and they in the state they have some issues where about 85% of the state, because these hunters really don't like wolves, unless it's in the 15% trophy zone, you can basically take a wolf anytime that you want. You don't have to have a special permit or anything like that. And what's even grosser is that you can kill an animal by what they call whacking, which is running over it. That includes with a snowmobile, because what else do you do on Saturday in Wyoming? So this applies to what they categorize as predatory animals. And these are who the predatory animals are: coyote, jackrabbits, porcupine, raccoon, red fox, skunks, and stray cats. So keep your cats inside in Wyoming. So there was a triggering provision in this bill that basically said that once wolves are delisted, they automatically go onto this list. So now they can be run down with snowmobiles. And that's what happened this year, if you hadn't heard about it. So this genius right here decided to run down a wolf on his snowmobile, and it was internally injured, and he captured it, taped duct tape around its mouth so it couldn't bite him, put a shock collar on it, and took it to that fine establishment right there, the Green River Bar. So he took this animal into the bar and kept it there for hours, letting people take pictures of it. And he like took pictures of himself kissing it. And there's like videos and all this stuff. And a wildlife biologist reviewed the footage and said this animal had massive internal damage, or it would have been fighting back and trying to get away from him every minute. So at the end of the evening, he just took it out back and shot it. So for this, he was given a $250 fine for possession of warm-blooded wildlife. So in response to that, there was a huge worldwide and public outcry here in the United States. And so the legislature formed the Wyoming Treatment of Predators Working Group. So I've had the pleasure to listen to their debates, and they're going to tighten up the law. They're just going to say vehicles instead of like snowmobiles. And then they're going to say, and then you have to kill the animal after. You can't take it to a bar. They didn't put the bar in there, but they just said you have to kill it immediately. And they were going to say humanely, but they pulled that out. And this means that whacking is still allowed. So one of the things I wanted to know is there's all these complaints that there's wildlife conflict with grazing animals and wolves and coyotes and all of this kind of stuff. But we have the Livestock Indemnity Program, which is a federal program that will pay under certain circumstances for reimbursement if an animal is lost. And one of those stipulations applies to wolves and avian predators. So if the government has reintroduced the wildlife, or if it's endangered, and we know that it's not endangered in Wyoming, but it was reintroduced by the government, then the Livestock Indemnity Program applies. So I did a FOIA to FOIA all the nationwide LIP payments from the start of LIP, because I'm the FOIA queen and I have a song about it, but I'm not going to sing it. Anyway, so this is my LIP data. So I have a lot more data than this. So from the start of LIP until like July of this year, there were 864 requests for payment. Out of all of those, only 10 were predator related. And out of that, 8 of those were avian. So are you telling me that all of these wolves are eating all of these cows and sheep and nobody's like going to get any money for that? They don't care. They're just like not making claims. I don't know. So one of the other issues is that there could be duplicative payments going on. LIP is not the only program. There are state programs, there are other federal programs. So are these folks double dipping? They might be. When I was looking at the data, sorry, it's too small, I can't read it. I looked at what the costs were in the predator zone and also in the trophy zone. Remember, the trophy zone is only like 15% of Wyoming, and the predator zone, that's the 85% where you can just kill an animal anywhere. I mean, a wolf, that is, or some other animals too. So anyway, the Wyoming Game and Fish rancher payments were for 2022 were for only 19 claims of depredation. And they paid out $226,298. And so out of that, about 70% was damage done to cattle. So when I was digging around, I found this really interesting Government Accountability Office report from 2017, where they chose 19 programs out of all of the different indemnity or other like grant programs in the United States to review, because they were worried that something might be wrong. And what do you know? This wolf program was one of the 19. And so the GAO said, the secretary needs to better define the parameters, and also they need to look for potential duplication. So there are a bunch of different other ones too that I haven't listed here, but the Wyoming Game and Fish and all of them, like when we look at how many cattle were killed, only 17, they killed 18 wolves for 17 cattle and then paid out all of that money. Now, I can't tell for sure when it comes to the lip payments, how much lip money was paid out. For wolves specifically, like there's a $5,000 something payment that went to Wyoming. And that was for cattle, not for other animals. There was one for sheep, but this is the only one that's during that time frame and not labeled avian. So that could have also been for wolves, not sure. So what can we do about predator management in the United States, especially on multi-use public lands? There are a lot of different things. I mean, when we look at mitigation issues, it's not always the same throughout the United States. There's a lot of different things that you can do, but it really depends on the species that you're trying to protect. And it also depends on the terrain where those animals are located, what you're capable of. But if you remember the ear tags that I mentioned that you should remember, there's a lot of new and interesting things coming out. So they're working on a combined solution using pheromones and also using speakers to play wolf noises and also use lights and different things. So there's all this new stuff that is being worked on right now, and they're looking at putting these things directly on the animal. So like in the ear tag, you could have pheromones distributed from the ear tag. They're also putting things like glow tape, like, I don't know if like you all went to raves, but like, glowing. Anyway, they put that on the ear tag, and it, if it's, if these animals are like out in the, not close to lights, but if they're out in the brush, that's really distracting for wolves. It's very different. So there's a lot of different things that we can do. And as lawyers, we should really be looking into some of these programs, seeing who's double dipping and if that's illegal at all. And if anybody wants my FOIA data, I'm glad to share it for good use. We also need to put these animals back under federal management. States have proven that they cannot manage them, especially if like the law says you can run over one with a snowmobile. And we need state legislative reform in Wyoming, and we need to protest the current state of their revision, which took the word humane out. But anyway, that's everything. Thank you.
Everybody. So this is all really interesting to hear. It makes me wonder if animal cruelty laws could be kind of applied on the public lands context, but I'm going to switch gears and talk about farm animal cruelty issues in the commercial context, which is, I think numerically where most of the cruelty is happening. And unfortunately, we're not getting a whole lot of real substantive application of the law, but I think there is hope, and I think there's some cool cases on this. So I'll be focusing on how to make those cruelty laws work, and specifically, how do we use private prosecution to get animal cruelty laws applied, and what is the deal with exemptions? How do we address exemptions, and kind of how should we be thinking of them? Okay, so but first I have to start with investigations. So the way Animal Outlook operates, the undercover investigations are sort of a crucial part. It's like the kind of body of evidence that we can build to think about, now, how do we leverage that for law, for campaigns, for publicity, et cetera. But when we're talking about cruelty, we are getting that fact record from investigations. And we're kind of in this unusual place in society where we know that most people oppose animal cruelty. I mentioned yesterday, it looks like 97% basically across the board oppose animal cruelty, yet we have these systems that are inherently cruel. They really rely upon animal cruelty to exist, and people just don't know. Now, that's by design. There's a lot of kind of influence that the industry has, but
it's something that has such a transparency and accountability problem that even just creating some transparency here can itself move the needle. So we are in a place where we're essentially trying to leverage that momentum and combine our legal strategy with the impact of the visuals themselves. Most of the messages we're all getting are coming from industry. Most of the messages, even if it's literally our job to go and try to dig up the truth on these things, you are getting thousands of messages that from people, speakers whose job it is to sell us more animal products. So, investigations are kind of that counterpoint to industry speech. Okay, so what is the deal with cruelty cases? So let's start with what I think of as the ideal / typical fact pattern for cruelty cases. I have 4 categories here, all of which I would call cruel by the way that the kind of affirmative definition of cruelty looks in a typical state animal cruelty law. So we're going to get into some cases that are interesting and have some sort of ways in and might have partial or full kind of exceptions to some of these things I'm about to say. But in most cases, we're talking about gathering evidence in a way that is going to be the most persuasive as we can be to a DA's office or similar. And unfortunately, those law enforcement entities, DA's offices, Sheriff's Department, even humane kind of SPCA type entities, often have a lack of expertise, are very local, can be in rural communities where the companies themselves are, major employers or have, kind of a lot more influence than we do as outsiders. And, the industry really plays upon that to, kind of capture that. And no way to force prosecution. I mean, in most cases, we're just basically doing everything we possibly can to make these people's jobs easier and make the arguments and put the evidence in a really, strong way in front of them. And they can just say, no, thank you, right? And, we don't have a lot that we can do with it. So I think the place to start, no matter what, is a really strong fact pattern. Why do I say ideal / typical? Because these categories all sort of blend together. And the reality is the longer you're in one of these places, it's just a matter of time before you're getting evidence that hits, all of these categories. You also could argue that a given issue or a given practice is, does not neatly fit into a given category here. So you have, for example, on the bottom, this is I don't know what's going on with this slide. I'm getting distracted. Something's happening. Put that down. Okay. On the bottom, you have what I would say is empirically common because we've seen it in a lot of places, but the industry isn't going to be sanctioning it. But it's also extremely cruel and egregious. So this is the use of a hip clamp in a dairy to drag an animal and hoist her up. It's obviously extremely painful, not the original intended purpose of the hip clamp. You don't hear the industry going out talking about how great this is. On the top, this is also common and a practice that I think would be considered standard and sanctioned by the industry. This is the use of hot iron to dehorn dairy calves. It's done in over 90% of the dairy industry, but in this case, it's done in a way that could be because the animal is too old, there's more pain being used. There are alternatives, including like anesthetic paste, but we know empirically they're not using that because it's just practically too difficult to wait around for the paste to kick in. And then in this case, they're also tying their face to the side of this cage. And you can see, I mean, this is a clip from a video, but you can see very obviously from the video that the animal is just in excruciating pain, kicking and everything. So, I mean, just the way I describe these 2 practices, you could easily stick them in any or all of these categories. So, all right. What is the deal with the law? So we don't have anything on the federal level that applies from the time the animal is born or hatched until the time they're sent off to be slaughtered. We do have some federal laws that are interesting. The 28-hour law is a transport law. It's almost never enforced. And I literally mean that like it's really, really rarely enforced. And the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act is enforced more, but it only applies to a small number of animals and is sort of notoriously bad. The USDA's ability to enforce it and willingness to enforce it is notoriously bad. So we are really left with these state animal cruelty laws. And every state has one. In almost all states, they are exclusively criminal. We'll get into a case where that's not the case. But most of these states have exemptions. In about 37 states, there's exemptions. So in reality, these are often treated like they're categorical exemptions. Like they're just, okay, well, this happened on a farm and therefore it can't be prosecuted. But actually they're written as affirmative defenses in most cases. So let's not be too quick to concede that, you know, these exemptions are often much less broad than what people are initially reading them to be. And I have a quick slide on this at the end too, because we don't have a lot of time to cover it, but I think there's also one of the coolest parts about animal law is that because of the challenges that we face in using these criminal cruelty laws, there has been such creative lawyering around using other causes of action for litigation where facially the litigation is not about animal cruelty at all or was never intended to protect animals, but the underlying harm actually is about animals. So I think that's very cool. I think there's can be a lot more of that done as well. Okay, so some more on exemptions. They often say things like normal agricultural operation, which is Pennsylvania, and we get into one of those cases, or standard or customary practices. And there's often very little case law. There's very little guidance on what they actually mean. So you're talking about a typical case where the law enforcement already does not want to do anything. So it gives them a good excuse not to do so. It's just not clear. It's just something that's not they have the expertise in. So then they often do a lot of deference to industry. And essentially what this comes down to in reality is industry functionally writing their own rules. So I think of these cruelty laws sometimes as, okay, we've defined cruelty, and then it's just like a blank space for industry to come in and just finish the definition, right? Like, except for these situations, which is not, I mean, that really should not be, you know, especially how a criminal law is written. But that kind of deference and, you know, in reality, kind of how it looks like kind of delegation to some industry expert can be, you know, informal. It can be a vet that, you know, often is an industry aligned vet who looks at a fact pattern and decides, oh, this is fine. Or formal, where the industry has created these standards, like the National Chicken Council standards, the farm standards for the dairy industry, et cetera. And sometimes, I mean, they very rarely look anything like the law or the standards that are in the law. But the fact that they exist functionally often stops anything from going forward, even when not only do they not align with what the legal standards are, and they are very weak, but they're still being violated in the facts we're presenting, that still can sometimes cause, you know, the law enforcement and prosecutors to back off. We also see a lot of erroneous interpretation of mens rea. I think there's this idea that people should only think about cruelty if it's like random, violent, sadistic cruelty. And in reality, like most of that cruelty, I mean, not that that doesn't happen, and happen a lot in these cases, but most of this cruelty is coming for, you know, business reasons in the course of doing these jobs. And that really violent, crazy stuff happens because when you're spending all day, you know, doing these horrible things, right? Ripping the testicles out of piglets and burning the horns off of cattle, like it's not going to feel weird to then, you know, kick them, right? So I think you expect when you go into these situations you have to kind of disabuse these prosecutors of the notion that you can't have cruelty that is sort of business-centric cruelty. Okay, and then before I get into cases, one more thing I want to say. You might be thinking, why don't we focus on the states then that don't have these exemptions? One of the weirdest things is, in our experience, it doesn't seem to matter if the state has the exemption. We have had a number of cases that feel just like absurd, where the decision makers are reading an exemption into the law where it doesn't exist, and nothing we can do can convince them otherwise, right? So I think best practices here is writing the arguments, you know, and kind of building your case and your evidence around the idea that this is cruel even though there is an exemption. And then in states where they don't have exemptions, you're basically adding that as a bonus argument. And also, you know, it doesn't matter what the industry thinks, right? This is cruel. Okay, so I have a couple of cases on the standard practices stuff. This is from an investigation that Animal did in Virginia of a Tyson facility. It's actually one of 3 separate investigations that we did. This little blue plastic rod is called a nose bone, and it is about to be shoved into the nostrils of the male broiler breeder bird. Now, not to go into too much background, but I think this is kind of an interesting practice because the reason that they're doing that is because the way that the chicken industry operates is that they're breeding them to grow so fast that if they let them live very long, the mortality rate is too high for it to be profitable for them. So most of these birds are killed at 6 weeks old. These parent flocks are killed older, like between the age of 1 and 2. So they actually keep them perpetually hungry because if they ate to satiety, they would get too big and it would start costing them money. But the females need a higher quality food because they're producing eggs. So they put these nose bones in the males so that when they go to get the food and there's like bars and they're just prevented from getting the female's food. So it's like cruelty on top of cruelty on top of cruelty. And it's all sort of very inherent to the sort of business model of the industry. So in this case, we worked with Michelle Welch at the Virginia Attorney General's office, who's amazing, whose job it is to focus on animal cruelty cases. This was her office's first farm animal case. And we were able to get 24 counts of cruelty against 9 people, including the managers of this facility. But one of the convictions that we got was for the practice of nose bones, despite the fact that Virginia has a very confusing common practice exemption. So this was the first time that of standard practice was the basis of a conviction for animal cruelty, which is a great kind of new ground, kind of milestone in this process. Also kind of cool about this, showing this to Tyson and, caused them pretty immediately to say, okay, we're going to stop using nose bones. And then we used it as a campaign and ended up very quickly getting 17 of the top 20 US poultry companies to either say they're not using them or will stop using them within like weeks. So sometimes, this is one of those practices that, yes, it was sanctioned by the industry, but it probably was not so relied upon that, they actually could make a change. So that's, kind of low hanging fruit. Okay. This one is another Virginia Tyson case. This was from last year, and we also worked with Michelle Welch's office in this one. So what's different here is much of the fact pattern was like neglect. So it was basically deprivation of food, water, deprivation of euthanasia, a lot of poor maintenance, like, buildings were falling apart, water lines were falling apart, biosecurity measures weren't being followed. It was the middle of a huge avian influenza crisis. So we were still able to get cruelty charges. August 1st, 2023, 8 animal cruelty charges were filed against the owner and 9 were filed against the manager. I mean, this case also had huge media. I think that always helps. That's a whole other topic. You can ask me about it later. We don't have time for that. But I love talking about that. So then last month, September of this year, we were able to get, the result of those charges was the manager pled guilty to 3 counts of animal cruelty, and the owner charges are still pending. So the common thread here, obviously, is that Virginia AG's office with Michelle Welch. And I think that really comes down to somebody who is going to give you fair process, somebody who's going to really engage with this stuff, look at the law, really apply it. I mean, it's, it's great to be able to kind of present that analysis and have somebody really engage with it. Okay, this one is a really interesting case. So this actually was where the stills from the earlier slide were from. This is a Pennsylvania dairy that we investigated and asked for 327 charges. So this is a great example of a case where we had that kind of mix of all the different types of cruelty in there, including the standard practice of hot iron disbudding, but all the way up to, the really egregious stuff. Like, I think in one case they cut a teat off, like threw it at the investigator. And was like, I hope you like hot dogs. I mean, like this place they're shooting the animals with, apparently guns that were not really equipped to do that. The animals are still suffering. Like it's a mix. I mean, it's so ironic with these cases because it's not, you have to always say, well, it's worse than we expected, but it's always worse than we expected in the sense that it's just a different list of things. Like there's always an educated guess we can make about what we're going to see. And then it's like, whoa, it got even worse or crazier. But at the same time, we know that we're going to get something we could describe in that way, kind of no matter where we go. So yeah, it was a good fact pattern, but not in atypical fact pattern, even though it was egregious, if that kind of makes sense. It's hard to wrap your heads around just how bad these things can be. We tried to get prosecution. I think Will Lowry is in the room. He was with us at the time. I'm still working on this case. So ask him. Yeah. He's done amazing on this case. So yeah, ask him about it. Like find him and ask him about this one if you like this one, because it's super, super interesting. Essentially, we were kind of ignored, stonewalled. The Pennsylvania State Police lied to the media about why we're doing. I mean, it was a lot. Like essentially, they said we're not doing anything about this. And so there is a way in Pennsylvania you can get a court to review the decision of the district attorney's office not to prosecute. And we lost at the trial level, won a really great appellate decision, which we were successful in making precedential. And it just is so validating. It's like the most robust way to walk through everything that we normally get just absolutely stonewalled for no reason on, like having to review the evidence in front of you and not just reviewing a small bit and favoring the evidence of the police, right? Like, just because there's a standard practice exemption, it doesn't mean that you can't do the analysis for cruelty. So that was great. Unfortunately, an unrelated case, when it went to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and changed that standard for how to get into court, use that avenue to get into court. And so then we had to re-argue it based on that, which was either bad faith or unconstitutionality, and we argued both. So now the oral argument was back in January. We're still waiting on a decision on that one. I'm running out of time. So this case is a small slaughterhouse in New Jersey that was killing both cows and horses. Most people don't think that's going on in the US. And this was a case where we kind of got hot potatoed around to different agencies to asking for enforcement, and were able to use a private prosecution avenue in New Jersey, and ultimately got the owner of the facility to plead guilty and receive the maximum fine on this. So, I mean, that was part of actually some other actions that were related to food safety that were really cool here, where FDA ended up engaging in this. And this might end up being kind of functionally the final blow for that slaughterhouse. And it's been around for a really long time. Okay, and then the last case is this is a case that we're doing with Legal Impact for Chicken, so I think their actually entire staff is here. So say hi to them too and ask them about this. So we did so we did an investigation of a hatchery in North Carolina and found sort of, again, a combination of standard stuff and sort of day-to-day sloppiness with some more egregious stuff, but I think kind of more on the line of the former. Couldn't get any prosecution, and then used the civil law in North Carolina, section 19A, which has an injunctive remedy, lost on the lower court level, but the company's argument is basically because they are they're a hatchery that's operating like, with permits as a hatchery, as a business, that they shouldn't be subject to this law at all. Right. And that's how they read those exemptions. And we're like, that's absolutely wrong and absurd. And you think that we're past that, we're not past that. So that's what we're arguing against on appeal, and hoping, that's still going. So we're hoping that that's going to be good. And then, this is my last slide. I feel like I mentioned this earlier. I feel like there's so many cool ways to use laws that don't look like animal cruelty laws at all to really get at underlying cruelty. When we can't get into through the criminal process, we're doing it this way and sort of shoehorning the criminal process into it. And there's a lot that could be continually done there. So I just have some examples on this slide. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So we are going to start our roundtable discussion and Q&A. If you would like to approach the microphones and ask a question to any of our panelists, feel free to do so. We have a question online.
Ranchers who graze on their own land oppose those grazing on public lands. It seems unfair competition.
Did you hear that?
All I heard was that it was about public land, but.
Could you repeat the question,
Yeah.
please? We didn't hear it back here.
Why don't ranchers who graze on their own land oppose those grazing on public land? It seems unfair competition.
Because. Does this work? Oh, it's working. Because And to understand, I assume that means because obviously if you're grazing on your private land, it's much more expensive. So why are we letting the grazing occur on public land at such a discount? Because that's unfair. I think that's the crux of the question. I mean, I think ranchers are doing a mix is part of it. So they might have grazing going on their own private land, but then they're also benefiting from the public land because they need to have the base property in order to qualify for the BLM permit. So I think those two things work together. So they're not necessarily in competition, but it's a good point. I mean, if there are ranchers that are just doing private grazing and paying way more, they certainly should be fighting to change the system.
You have a question?
Hi, my name is Ann Finney. I'm a deputy prosecutor up in Clark County. And kind of a two-part question on the grazing and everything with the death of the Chevron deference. How can we go outside the regulatory agencies to kind of work around that issue? I mean, obviously, they don't apply NEPA as it is supposed to act. But now with complete death of Chevron, where can we go from there? And also with the prosecutions, are states moving more towards trying to work those exemptions as affirmative defenses? So it kind of shifts that burden back to, the farmers and everything that are being prosecuted. Why can't we shift those more to affirmative defenses as opposed to exemptions?
Did you want to answer that?
You can go, it's fine.
Yeah, so the laws are written, I mean, the crux of it is the problem. We shouldn't start by thinking that the problem is the way the laws are written, because I think there's a lot more that we can get out of the laws as they're written than we do get out of them for commercial animal cruelty. And one of those things is they are often written as affirmative defenses. Those exemptions are often written as affirmative defenses. And we just don't get there. There's no real doctrine, like it doesn't sort of volley back and forth enough. We'll have scenarios where, let's say, like, for example, in the Martin case, they had a local vet who looked at everything and, kind of said, well, I think in general, yeah, they're doing some bad things, but I think in general, this isn't really out of the norm of what is being done in the general area, which is not the first time we'd heard that interpretation of the meaning of the normal agricultural operation in Pennsylvania. It just does not comply with how the case law is written. I mean, there's not a lot of case law, but it's just wrong. And we had a case before where they kind of used that they actually had literally rolled a dice. We had a egg farm case. They'd rolled a dice and decided which barn to go into to have the expert look at it. And it wasn't any of the barns that we'd investigated. So it's like this very weird, like, well, yeah, like they're doing some bad stuff, but like it's generally fine if we kind of like squint our eyes and look at it in a very blurry way, right? But so then we get stuck being like, hello, like, can we actually look at the way that this should be analyzed? And until the Martin opinion, we never had really gotten anything that validated that position that we should have that fair review. It was just more luck of the draw in terms of who was there doing the review for us. So I think it's more a question of making those laws work to the degree that they can, because you could have laws written beautifully if people aren't going to actually go through that process and use them well. It's not going to help.
You mentioned a lot of self-regulation effectively, whether written into the law or de facto by industry. Have you looked at decisions like Eubanks or the Amtrak cases that went up to the Supreme Court and then back down to DC Circuit, saying that self-regulation is a violation of the due process clause and using that to attack those laws?
That's a really good idea. I don't know those cases, but we are arguing in Martin that it is unconstitutional, like delegation. But I think that it sounds like along the same lines as the argument that you're making. I'm not sure that we made any equal protection arguments, but yeah, and we have the same kind of idea around 28-hour. So I think if we could even get sort of a foothold on that argument somewhere, I think there's a lot that we could do with it. But it's just been the way, I mean, it was just such, not to use a non-vegan phrase here, but it was just such political horse trading to get these laws written the way that they're written in the first place, that I think it wasn't sort of like beautifully thought out into the future. And now we're trying to reverse that to be more in accordance with something fair. Not even something like, I mean, if I were writing laws, they'd be much, much more aggressive, but it's like, just get us to where we should be based on how they are written, right? Yeah.
So my question, I work a lot on corporate policies, and food businesses are constantly talking about zero deforestation and conversion-free commitments overall within their beef supply chain, be it JBF, Cargill, whoever. So my point is that I take the environmental impact and on the grazing lands and so on and so forth, but would the counterfactual then be that it plays into the food industry's idea that these animals now need to be housed indoors so that you're able to do methane capture and push forward that zero deforestation and conversion-free claims, as well as this whole carbon tunnel syndrome that the industry seems to have gotten itself into. So I'm trying to figure out that while there is a case to be made that these animals need, or these ranchers shouldn't have discounted rates to access these pasture lands, but would playing that up mean that the industry has a really good reason to bring these animals indoor, and then that could have a negative impact on welfare of these animals overall?
I didn't catch the whole question. I apologize. I'm hard of hearing, so I don't always hear everything. So I guess the question comes back to the argument to be made for, because bringing the animals indoor and that would compromise their welfare. Is this sort of like a trade-off? Is that what you're saying? I guess my issue is more that it shouldn't be $1.35. It shouldn't be done without any sort of checks and balances in place. I mean, allegedly they have the NEPA analysis, but the statistics show that that is not happening, not at the application level or the renewal level. And if it does happen, no one really seems to care what the results are. That's kind of what it seems, what I've found. So I hear what you're saying. Like, it would be nice, it would be better for the animals for a welfare perspective for them to be outside, and there's something to that. And I think, that makes sense, but we still need to have all these checks and balances in place. And maybe we don't charge $1.35 per animal, because that's ridiculous. And these are multi-million-dollar companies for the most part. I think they can afford to pay a little bit more. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Hello. Jamie, would you be willing to share your FOIA song? with
Yes,
us?
please. Yeah, reach out to me. Anybody who wants
I
it can
meant-
have it.
I meant right now at the podium, if you're willing. I mean,
Yeah, sure.
all right, let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Oh, what, all the FOIA?
Your FOIA song.
Oh, no, no. Well, so ABBA has something that rhymes with FOIA Queen, sort of. It's another Queen song. No, I really can't sing for sure. Yes, my niece made me sing the song, and when I started singing, she said, "Auntie, it's okay. You don't have to sing." Yeah, but Cynthia can sing it. So fun fact, she was in Nashville recording.
well,
Yeah,
yeah.
she's got a long history of, yeah. So karaoke later.
I'll work on the ABBA
The
song
FOIA
for
Queen
you.
song, yeah.
I'll forego my question if Cynthia will sing.
Uh-oh.
It's getting deeper.
I'll ask it then. So NEPA was mentioned a few times, and I'm wondering how significant you think the National Defense Authorization Act rider in 2015, basically exempting grazing permits from NEPA is. Is that the problem, or do you think it's a broader issue?
I mean, I think the problem goes back before that. I think that's contributing to the problem, but I wouldn't say it's the whole problem. I think the problem is just this like systemic issue we have in society, and the government has to promote ag at all costs. And any way they can do that to make life easier for big ag, they're going to do it. And that's a very animal rightsy stance, which is who I am inside. So that's what I'm saying. But I think that's what it comes down to.
Other questions? Do we have any online questions? Oh,
Yeah, I just want to make one sort of just informational thing about NEPA. There's actually a major NEPA case in the Supreme Court right now, which threatens to cut back even further on NEPA coverage. And my organization's involved in that. And I will be talking about that at tomorrow's wildlife panel. So if people want to hear about the future of NEPA, which may actually even be worse than the present of NEPA, you can get more information on that. My suspicion also is that a lot of what's gone on is the expansion of what are called categorical exclusions under NEPA, where they're not exemptions per se. It's just agencies like these categorically excluding a lot of impacts from any kind of other more extensive NEPA coverage. The good news is I think the Endangered Species Act has had some valuable effect on the use of renewals of permits on federal lands. And so I think if we look to the future, at least in the federal system, NEPA is probably not going to be a place we can count on getting a lot of additional ammunition, but the Endangered Species Act is a fertile area. So any thoughts about that, but also just to let people know, we will be talking a lot more about NEPA at the wildlife discussion tomorrow, and especially, where the Supreme Court is maybe heading in its latest foray into that area of the law.
Thank you for that
Yeah,
comment.
yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing.